one thing I'd certainly want to talk to you about is your specialisation in arbitration and alternative dispute resolution, or ADR as it's known. That, in a way, is a bit of a misnomer, alternative dispute resolution, because it sounds like it's new, and it isn't new, of course. It's been around a very long time. But one of the strongest perceptions about ADR is that it's a more creative, less adversarial approach to problem solving. Is that why you were attracted to arbitration? Because it's less adversarial than perhaps a typical career at the bar and being a barrister might entail?
No, I'll have to come in here. And it goes into the reason why I took early retirement from the bench. When I went on the bench, I had an open mind about whether I would want to stay on the bench until I was 70 years of age. In the case of the Supreme Court, of course, it's 72 years. I always thought that I'd never been wanting to rush into going on the bench. I'd knocked back officers, I'm sure other people had before. But when I took the job, I thought, well, you know, I might want to do something else in life other than be a judge. Out of the blue, when I was about 65 years of age, I was approached by solicitors for the British government to be an arbitrator, or one of 3 arbitrators, in a huge arbitration in Europe. It was the biggest arbitration running in the world at that stage. It was an arbitration between the British government and the Iranian government about a dispute about an armaments contract. What had happened was that this is one of the interesting things in my life. The Shah of Iran, before he was deposed by the Ayatollah, whatever his Khomeini.
Ayatollah Khomeini.
Yeah. The Shah had realised he was facing serious troubles in his own country, so he decided to equip himself with the very latest state-of-the-art tanks and other armaments. And he let a huge contract with the British government's armaments company to provide him with 1,500, I think it was, hugely expensive tanks and other things. And so they signed a contract with their usual cunning. The British insisted on payment in advance of a huge sum of money. The contract was running. Only some of the tanks had been delivered. Ayatollah came into power. Shah fled, and the Ayatollah and his crowd knew, as everybody in the world knew, about this contract. So he decided he would tear it up. So what physically happened was this. He sent some of his guards down to the British embassy in Tehran to get the contract so he could look at it and get rid of it if he could. And the guards went down, the British ambassador said, I haven't got the contract. And they said, we don't believe you. And in the end, at gunpoint, they said, look, we want this contract, and the ambassador produced it. And they took it back to the then Iranian government, and they looked at it, and they said, oh, we're going to terminate this, and they fired off a letter to London terminating the contract. Not realising, I suspect, that the British were holding in London this huge amount of a prepayment. So under the contract, which was just a conventional commercial contract between governments, there was a provision that if a dispute arose, it could be arbitrated by the International Chamber of Commerce. So coming back, was long-winded, it will lead into what I'm about to say. Out of the blue, the solicitors for the British government wrote to me asking whether I could accept nomination as their nominee on this three-man arbitration panel. So I assumed, of course, I could not do that, being a judge. So I discussed it with Nigel Bowen, who was then our Chief Justice, and he said to me, I wouldn't assume that. He said, when I was Attorney General, and he was, of course, in his day, before he became Chief Justice of the Federal Court.
And very highly regarded too.
Yeah, very highly regarded. He said, why don't you speak to Lionel Bowen, who he got on very well with, just recently died, of course, because the Australian government would always respond positively, if it could, to requests for use of an Australian judge in a special circumstance. And in fact, they had done so, I think, in his day. There was some dispute in Cyprus, and they got Ken Jacobs, I think, who was then a High Court judge. Anyway, so I said to the Lionel Bowen, well, look, Mr Attorney, I obviously wouldn't take this on unless you approved. Oh, yeah, that'll be quite okay, no problem. So I said to him, well, I'll take it on and I won't accept any fee beyond my judicial salary. So he said, that's all right. So I took it on. But before I took it on, I inquired how long the arbitration would take, and I was told correctly it would either be very short or very long. There was a legal point the British government was taking, and if it was decided in its favour, the whole thing would go away. If it wasn't decided in its favour, it would be an exceedingly complex and lengthy exercise. So I took it on that basis. We decided this point against the British, so I then decided I'm going to retire from the Federal Court because I didn't think it was fair to stay on the court and be away for a very lengthy period. So I got into arbitration, so to speak, in that way. Then, in addition, after I did that, and almost contemporaneously, when my friend Ellicott got to know that I was retiring, he was sitting with Ron Castan as one of... Ron was one, Ellicott was a second, and they needed a third arbitrator to join them in deciding a very big dispute involving oil royalties in the Bass Strait. So I knew that if I retired from the court, I would have a lot of very interesting work to do as an arbitrator. So that's why I retired from the Federal Court, for no other reason.